Good evening, everyone. My name is Kaylee Perret-Shaughnessy, and I'm the Executive Director of the Whittier Birthplace. It's my honor to welcome Kevin Bryant of the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site as our speaker this evening. He's going to be speaking about Frederick Douglass, the master of language. Frederick Douglass developed himself into a master of the English language. His words, recorded in ink, roared off the page into the ears of audiences around the world. As he battled for a just world and certainly a better America, he found influence everywhere. This self-taught warrior drew inspiration from across time and cultures. Among those shaping the words of one of America's finest writers was John Greenleaf Whittier. What do we know about their relationship? Well, that's why we're here tonight. So thank you, Kevin. And I'll pass on the microphone to you.
All right, thank you so much. Good to be with all of you here on this journey. I'm going to share my screen real quick. And give me a thumbs up if you can see the PowerPoint real quick. Good for me. All right. We are all good and ready to go. So there will be opportunity at the end of this. If you have questions, by all means, I'm in no rush. I'm happy to hang around. We can chat as long as you want when we are done here. But in 1833, John Greenleaf Whittier publishes this anti-slavery pamphlet seen here, Justice and Expediency. A part of his turning point into the world of abolition, it compelled him to become one of the founding members of the American Anti-Slavery Society, signing its declaration in 1833. And at that same moment in time, when John Greenleaf Whittier is signing this declaration, one future member of that society is a 15-year-old named Fred Bailey. And unbeknownst to this young Fred Bailey, while Whittier is putting his signature on this, Frederick is mere days away from experiencing the worst moments of his life. This young Fred Bailey was enslaved in Maryland. He had bucked the very system of enslavement that tried to define him by birthing literacy out of himself. A fully literate and increasingly independent teenage Fred Bailey was becoming a major problem for those who were seeking to enslave his body. And remembering the time period that we are in, around this 1833, 1834 window, the memories of Nat Turner are fresh in the minds of many folks around America. Someone leading resistance against the enslavement system. And the big question that many of the enslavers around this Fred Bailey are wondering in these same years is this the next one? Can we stop him before it gets to that point of leading a revolution? Was Fred Bailey the soon to become next Nat Turner? It was sure looking like it in the eyes of many around him. He was not only literate, he was teaching others. He was running secret schools. He was encouraging resistance, all the while suffering in this inhuman system. And because of this behavior, his behavior, which I will be clear, is simply asserting his natural humanity, soon Fred Bailey would be sent to a man named Edward Covey, who is described as a slave breaker, determined to shatter his spirit and independence through torture, abuse, and dehumanization. And as Frederick described it, this man was the worst of the worst in this area. So while Whittier and others with the American Anti-Slavery Society are beginning their formal work here, Fred Bailey, with this horrifying slave breaker, is now, instead of being disciplined or tortured by him, he is beating and choking this man, declaring himself to be from that point forward a man always and forever. As he wrote about these moments, he said, quote, "I seized Covey hard by the throat. My resistance was so entirely unexpected that Covey seemed taken all aback. He trembled like a leaf. I held him uneasy, causing the blood to run where I touched him with the ends of my fingers. We were at it for nearly 2 hours. He had drawn no blood from me. but I had from him. As Whittier and others began journeying in coming years, speaking and lobbying for abolition, Fred Bailey continued running schools and creating allies, now confident that the system of slavery could only temporarily confine him. It would no longer be able to hold him. He plots escapes. He forged free passes for others. He sought freedom for himself. His assertion of his humanity also created a ton of problems for the enslavers who were trying to control his movements. And their failure to control him was complete on September 3rd of 1838, when Fred Bailey boldly struck out for freedom, leaving his enslaver clueless as to his whereabouts. And vanishing into the north, this 20-year-old Frederick connected with Anna Murray in New York City. Anna, seen here on the left, a source of funding and strength on his journey. Anna and Frederick assumed new names to disguise themselves in exile. They got married. They continued north into Massachusetts, where they changed names again to remain elusive and undiscoverable. Anna Murray became Anna Douglass, and Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey became Frederick Douglass. And from that point on, it's that name we will know him as. The rest is history. In time, though, now the newly minted Douglass became a member of that same society that was founded by Whittier along with others. And by age 23, Douglass was a traveling speaker, commanding audiences across the Northeast sections of the United States. Douglass emerged onto the speaking scene in 1841. And Whittier, in coming years at the same time, would begin eventually stepping out of the world of active abolition. But during their brief active overlap, it is unknown exactly if they met in those first couple years of the 1840s, but unquestionably, Douglass was highly aware of Whittier's contributions and his involvement, which is some of what we'll kind of explore together here. Some of the occasions where we know they intersected with each other, even if it wasn't always face to face. Again, Douglass enters this world as a paid speaker in 1841. By November 1842, about a year into his active abolition campaigning, Douglass's attention became focused on something called the Latimer case. And as was to be expected in this time, the abolitionist movement seized upon any circumstance that would provide ammunition for their cause. This was one of those many events. This Latimer moment happened in October 1842 when George Latimer had been arrested and locked up in a Boston prison. He was locked up solely on the written order of a jailer from Suffolk County named James B. Gray, who claimed that Latimer was a runaway slave. Abolitionist opinion was aroused by this arrest and was further agitated by the fact that the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts court refused to grant a writ of habeas corpus that would release Latimer for jail. That's one of those constitutional protections that, in theory, should be in place for everybody. This right to know what you are being accused of and have the right to a trial, not just to be jailed indefinitely. And alarmed at what he called, quote, this daring assault upon the Palladium of liberty, the abolitionists began holding Latimer meetings throughout the state. And moved by Latimer's plight and ever eager to sound freedom's harp, Whittier, the poet, steps in, sending word to Virginia that Massachusetts had registered a vow in heaven that she would suffer, quote, no slave hunt in our borders, no pirate on our strand, no fetters in the Bay State, no slave upon our land. With these words, Douglass now writes his first ever public letter released out, where he echoes Whittier's dissent to the decisions of that Massachusetts justice. Douglass, with these words in his heart, spoke vehemently on behalf of, as he said, our outraged brother who had been hunted down like a wild beast and ferociously dragged through the streets of Boston. As Douglass's star continued to rise with this and other events, Whittier seems to have been stepping back from the active portions of the movement, but there's no reason to see a connection between one entering and the other leaving. And although Whittier seems to be withdrawing from active abolition, his heart seems very clearly to have remained in the right place. And one of his 1837 publications seems as if it was written about this rising young man in his 20s. Up then in freedom's manly part, from gray eld to fiery youth, and on the nation's naked heart, scatter the living coals of truth. Up while ye slumber, deeper yet, the shadow of our fame is growing. Up while ye pause, our sun may set, in blood around our altars flowing. This fiery youth, Douglass, is now traversing the entire country, broadened from just the Northeast, covering the entire country, scattering these living coals of truth. And the shadow of fame is indeed growing for him. At this same moment in history, Frederick Douglass goes viral. Taking the next step in his life's journey, he put all of his doubters to rest by publishing his life story, his autobiography, in 1845, called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. His book is so transformative and so successful that Frederick Douglass couldn't even keep this book in print. He kept running out. His fame skyrockets across the globe internationally. But twice, in his very small narrative, twice, Douglass is going to include significant excerpts of Whittier's poetry. In chapter 8, he refers to Whittier in this text as the slave's poet. And when Douglass gets to one of these poignant moments in his journey here in this story, he reflects on the unknown fate of his dearly beloved grandmother, Betsy Bailey. And as he says, "If my poor grandmother now lives, she lives to suffer in utter loneliness. She lives to remember and mourn over the loss of children, the loss of grandchildren, and the loss of great-grandchildren. They are, in the language of the slave's poet Whittier, gone, gone, sold and gone, to the rice swamp, dank and lone, where the slave whip ceaseless sings, where the noisome insect stings, where the fever demon strews poison with the falling dews, where the sickly sunbeams glare through the hot and misty air. Gone, gone, sold and gone, to the rice swamp, dank and lone. From Virginia's hills and waters, woe is me, my stolen daughters." Of no one in his narrative does Douglass write so fondly as about his grandmother, Betsy Bailey. And to channel his inner soul, Whittier's voice resonated with his pain. Throughout the remaining course of his life, Frederick Douglass will write 2 more additional autobiographies, both in 1855 as well as 1881. But in both of those coming editions, he found no improvements on Whittier's language and maintained this excerpt throughout the entire edition unchanged and untouched from what we see here. But back in the 1845 narrative, infuriated by what he's seeing as the role of Christianity in upholding enslavement, Douglass again draws on Whittier in chapter 11 by quoting from clerical oppressors. "Just God and these are they who minister at thine altar, God of right, men who their hands with prayer and blessing lay on Israel's ark of light. What, preach and kidnap men? Give thanks and rob thy own afflicted poor? Talk of thy glorious liberty, and then bolt hard the captive's door? What, servants of thy own, merciful Son, who came to seek and save the homeless and the outcast, fettering down the tasked and plundered slave? Pilate and Herod friends, Chief priests and rulers as of old combine, just God and holy is that church which lends strength to the spoiler thine. After publishing his narrative, which included these among many other words, Douglass flees into exile out of the United States. He knows he's no longer safe here. He revealed his identity and his location in an era of human traffickers desperately hunting for him, and whatever new name he may have adopted, he's revealed it all. His exile takes him to Ireland, to England, to Scotland, and upon arriving in Ireland, Douglass immediately recognizes he needs to create an Irish edition of his narrative to continue production and publication. He publishes the second edition, the Irish edition, which, just as the American edition did, quickly sells out. But in his second edition, Douglass makes a few changes from the very first. And in doing just a few of these minor changes, one of them pays John Greenleaf Whittier an even greater compliment by not only quoting him in some of those excerpts we shared in, but by including an new excerpt from the 1834 poem Expostulation on the title page itself. So when you open the Irish edition of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, the very first thing you encounter are Whittier's words, where they say, "What, ho, our countrymen in chains, the whip on woman's shrinking flesh, our soil yet reddening with stains, caught from her scourging, warm and fresh. What, mothers from their children riven? What, God's own image bought and sold, Americans to market driven and bartered as the brute for gold." While travailing the British Isles for the better part of the next 2 years, Douglass gives many addresses over there. And in an address given in Bristol, England, on September 2nd of 1846, Douglass discusses the origins of how he understands the modern abolition movement and its intersection with Quakerism. He says, quote, "In the early days of anti-slavery in America, the Friends, seeing the struggle going on for emancipation, flocked around the abolition standard. Their influence was great. John G. Whittier, one of the noblest of the earth, stood forward in behalf of the slave, and he and others subjected themselves to the violence of the pro-slavery population." On an 1847 stage in London, Douglass is quoting from memory multiple stanzas of Whittier's poems as he travels around. Clearly, he's a fan. He's getting enmeshed with these words early on. He's still in his 20s at this point in time. And as the years wear on, Douglass will eventually be able to return to America safely. He will establish himself upon his return as a printer, as a publisher, and as he does so, this master of the English language was forever indebted to Whittier for his anti-slavery vocabulary. For one who had never personally experienced enslavement as Douglass had, Whittier's prose spoke to the heart in a way that often only the absolute best of art and poetry can do. Back in America in 1851, Douglass, standing on a Rochester, New York stage, quotes an entire section from Whittier's Farewell to the Virginia Slave Mother to Her Daughters. And even in his much beloved What to the Slave is the 4th of July address, there too, he used Whittier's words. About halfway through this dynamic address, given in Rochester's Corinthian Hall, Douglass employs quotes from the stanzas of the times. And in future speeches, Douglass will use this same idea of Whittier's stanzas of the times quote. He will use this at least 5 more times that I was able to track down. There's probably more that slipped through the cracks even. And he's still using some of these quotes all the way into the 1890s as he reaches the end of our journey, as Douglass at least seems to have interpreted Whittier's words in his context here. Douglass seems to have grasped around the stanzas of the times as how Can people stay silent in the face of such evil? I believe Douglass sees the stanzas of the times as a call to action for generations confronted by injustice. He repurposes especially the stanzas for the times over and over and over. And in his newspapers, Douglass is going to be involved in publishing and editing 4 different ones at different stages in his life. In his newspapers, the North Star, Douglass's Monthly, Frederick Douglass's paper, the New National Era. Douglass recurringly publishes Whittier's verses in his editorials. There are dozens of examples from Douglass's papers printing word for word Whittier's poems across the decades of his newspaper publishing. And as he included in the March 23rd, 1855 edition, speaking of the abolitionist movement, he says, quote, "The most brilliant of American poets volunteer in its service. Whittier speaks in burning verse to more than 30,000 in the national era. The poets are with us. They awaken sympathies for the slave in which anti-slavery principles take root, grow up, and flourish." Douglass continues in 1855, publishing his second autobiography. This is not a new edition of the first one. It's an entirely new book called My Bondage and My Freedom. And in this much more expansive account that he told a little more briefly in his first take through, Douglass expands his account. Included in that is more excerpts of Whittier to convey the awful brutality that he experienced in his childhood. It is impossible to argue that Frederick Douglass was not deeply steeped in Whittier's words. And while they may have had philosophical differences on the process, the strategies, the techniques of abolition, Douglass finds in Whittier's ink words that even he, the man who lived it, cannot improve upon. Douglass is using Whittier's voice to describe some of these darkest experiences in his journey. And Frederick Douglass was not a man known to struggle to come up with words. We even hear you saying, John Greenleaf Whittier can express my feelings at this moment in my terrible yet hopeful journey. Douglass spoke that he had no love for America. He had no country, he says at one point. He says, "I have no patriotism. I cannot. This nation will not allow it." And he says, quote, "I desire to see the country's overthrow as speedily as possible, its constitution shivered in 1,000 fragments." Reading the full text of Douglass's address that included those words, Whittier asserted to some friends that Douglass was a little too harsh with his take here. But Whittier also acknowledged the argument Douglass made was a compelling one, even if it went a little further than Whittier may have been comfortable with. As Douglass says, "If the anti-slavery movement shall fail now, it will not be from outward opposition, but from inward decay. Its auxiliaries are everywhere. Scholars, authors, orators, poets, and statesmen give it their aid." These two men, Douglass and Whittier, may not have agreed on tactics, on language, or beliefs, but they didn't have to. They joined with many to remain largely united in end goals, even if how to achieve those end goals was far from agreed upon. Very rarely can you find any two abolitionists who agree on everything, start to finish, especially as we're moving into the later 1850s and a sectional crisis among the states is becoming more and more apparent and looming much more ominous. And the war comes. And as several states across the South begin seceding and opening a state of rebellion, Douglass in Boston captures this moment by quoting lines from Whittier's Voice of New England, speaking to the tumult surrounding him. Douglass and Whittier are even going to find themselves both in Boston on the exact same days in January of 1863. But all accounts that I was able to track down place them very close to each other, but at two very different events happening simultaneously for very similar reasons. Douglass describes these two events as, quote, the two machines functioning at the exact same time. And for these machines, one of them was a gathering at a music hall where Whittier was. The other of these two machines of abolition was a gathering at Tremont Temple where Douglass was. So again, engaging in that same community, engaging in the same work. They're so close to each other, but they don't seem to have been at the same event, although they're moving forward with the same hearts. Very soon, though, with Black troops marching through the very streets itself, going off in defense of the United States, as noted historian Benjamin Quarles wrote, quote, the poet Whittier forsook his pacifism for an hour to get a glimpse of the marching Black troops. It was the only regiment he viewed during the war, and he never forgot the scene. Another moment where Whittier and Douglass are so close to each other. Not only was Frederick Douglass also here to watch these troops march through the street, but Douglass was one of the key recruiters itself who brought this organized fighting force into existence. He was one of the driving forces that created this and other units. And as Whittier watched these soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts, the ranks of them passing by, he likely didn't know it, but among those faces that he saw would have been two of Frederick and Anna's boys who had enlisted, Lewis and Charles Douglass, the Douglass boys, off to war, with their father, the voice booming behind them to keep up the cause. Both of these boys, soon to rise in rank, would see combat, and Lewis especially would be grievously wounded during an assault the 54th Massachusetts makes on Fort Wagner, made famous in that movie Glory. With the war over, by 1870, Douglass addresses a reform convention, but immediately before he addresses this New York City convention, a public letter from John Greenleaf Whittier was read to the assembly, and then Douglass got up. Hearing the letter where Whittier, among so much else, calls for a special thanks to God for the progress that has led to this moment, Douglass immediately rises in that aftermath and, from his prepared remarks, improvises a portion of his remarks in response to Whittier's letter. Douglass countered a little bit of what Whittier had put into that letter, where Douglass says, one of the resolutions proposes to give thanks to God and none especially to men. I like to thank men. I like to thank the people I see. Those people who give all their thanks to God, I have suspicion of. Not that I suspect at all John G. Whittier, but I have no sort of sympathy with that kind of religion that expresses its devotion to God by neglect of their fellows. All through the anti-slavery struggle, men have asked, do you love the Lord? These men show no love to their fellow men. I want to express my love to God and gratitude to God by thanking those faithful men and women who have devoted their energies, who've devoted the energies of their souls to the welfare of mankind. It is only through such men and women that I can get any glimpses of God anywhere. Now, this is a little unfair because Whittier was not present to clarify or address Douglass's commentary on his letter, but that is also to be expected of, again, this broad tent of human rights will not see all of its champions in universal agreement with each other. At that same juncture in time, 1870, a new newspaper debuts in Washington, D.C., the New Era. And soon, Frederick Douglass, himself about to move permanently to Washington, D.C., buys a sizable stake in this new paper and becomes its chief editor and publisher. In one of the opening editorials, he pens, the fact that our paper dares to take its place among the many lights existing to guide and the many shields uplifted to defend the colored race in their transition from bondage to freedom requires neither defense nor apology. Douglass, now as the torchbearer for the New Era, built it in the model of an older abolitionist paper, the National Era, published weekly from 1847 to 1860 by Gamaliel Bailey, with significant help from John Greenleaf Whittier. Connecting with the spirit of Whittier's paper that he had been involved in, that had been such a vibrant political and literary voice across the years, Douglass rechristens this new era into the new national era. Not only did he follow and continue much of the stylistic choices of that earlier paper, but he also simply updated the name of the paper Whittier was involved with. Douglass now capturing his new national era as this spiritual successor to the one that Whittier had recently been involved in. On so many occasions, Douglass and Whittier seem to be so close to each other, but so few meetings appear in the known historical record to the best of my knowledge, and then in terms of them being face to face. Though their circles overlapped time and again in print and on stage back and forth, in 1882, a 64-year-old Douglass pays a visit to a 74-year-old Whittier. And fortunately for us, because Douglass talked a lot, he stood on a Boston stage and narrated to his audience after the fact his remembrances of his visit with John Greenleaf Whittier. And he said about this moment, quote, "I heard that John G. Whittier, the poet of humanity, was feeble, and unless I went to see him at once, I should never see him again. I was sad. Acting on this suggestion, I made my way to Danvers and had the inexpressible pleasure of taking the hand of that brilliant man, who has said perhaps more than any other man for humanity. I found him well and sprightly as a man of 60, though under the weight of 79. I said to him, I come to you as all others came to you, with nothing to give, all to receive. You are one of those who framed the Constitution of the Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. He told me of these beginnings at a time when I was still in the bondage of slavery. Said he, I did not expect to live to see the slaves emancipated. I thought we would bear our testimony, and later the right would come. Whittier also shared with him of the burning of Pennsylvania Hall due to the abolitionist meeting occurring there, and the rising of the society out of those ashes to continue moving forward. Rather than that burning being the end, it was simply another chapter in the ongoing struggle. And Douglass continues after Whittier has shared those pieces. Douglass says, quote, "We rejoiced together over the vast and wonderful changes that have taken place since that 1833 day. On that 1833 day, Whittier signed the Declaration. And on that same 1833 day again, Douglass, then known as Frederick Bailey, was still caught in these evils of enslavement, about to enter that whole new world with that slave breaker, Edward Covey, noting that Whittier was, by the date of their meeting here, one of only the last two surviving original signers of that convention's declaration. Douglass, maybe inspired by Whittier, channeled his own inner poet for a moment and wrote, "The leaves are falling all around us, and soon all that remains must fade and fall." Though he mentioned Whittier's name in 1889 as being hallowed and should be accompanied right alongside Lincoln and Garrison and Sumner and Phillips, the leaves continued to fall, culminating with Whittier's 1892 death. Douglass, now remarried with his second wife, will attend this funeral, the funeral of his dear anti-slavery comrade. But we have no known accounts, letters, or memories of Douglass describing this experience. We simply know he was there. But upon returning home, Douglass no doubt found some new meaning in a few of his possessions here as we wrap up. In Douglass's well-stocked library of over 1,000 volumes, it included one by John Greenleaf Whittier, The Tent on the Beach and Other Poems, an item that not only did Douglass have and make notes in, but which we still have in his library to this very day. The same week as Whittier's passing, Douglass, with a journalist visiting him in his home, was asked to name his 6 favorite poets. Whittier arising as one of those 6 names that Douglass presented. And the same journalist who got Douglass to list his favorite poets and separately his favorite authors also saw Douglass show him around his Washington, D.C. house, pointing out some of the priceless belongings that Douglass had amassed in his life's journey. And sitting peacefully on Douglass's parlor mantle, even to this very day in 2023, sits a small blue and white ceramic tile, one of these priceless belongings to Douglass. And as the journalist wrote about this moment, Mr. Douglass was particular to point out a rich but modest picture of the home of John G. Whittier. The tile sits in his home. This tile still sits in his home. It may be a stretch to call Frederick Douglass and John Greenleaf Whittier friends. Undoubtedly, more research may yet be able to reveal even stronger connections than what I am aware of. But there can be no doubt at all about it. John Greenleaf Whittier had a profound impact on Frederick Douglass. It is clear that Douglass was reading Whittier's work from his earliest days of freedom and continued reading and immersing himself in that work up till his very last days of life. From Whittier's work, Douglass is drawing inspiration, guidance, and perhaps a little bit of healing of the soul from it as well. So at this point, I'd like to open up the floor. Of course, if folks have questions, things, you're welcome to put them into the chat, or if you would wish as well, you can unmute. Happy to answer any questions, clarify anything that anyone may have, whether about directly this material or not.
Hi, Kevin.
Hi.
I'm Janet Howell from Amesbury, and I was president of the Whittier home in Amesbury when we did the renovation and restoration of the house. So I'm extremely interested. It was a very fine lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just was not aware of the connection between Douglass and Whittier. And so this is just like a whole new world to me. And I hope you can come talk to the women and men at the Whittier home. My question is, how involved was Douglass with Garrison?
Douglass is tremendously involved with Garrison.
Yeah.
For the early, I should clarify that, for the early years of his abolitionist activities, Douglass was tremendously close with Garrison. Garrison, in a sense, is the one who kind of discovers Douglass, if we could use those words. Hears him on a stage in 1841 with some pressure go up, and even Garrison will write that never before had he hated slavery so much as this first time he heard this random guy he didn't know named Fred Douglass take to a stage. And I think that says a lot for Garrison, who made his life out of hating slavery. Say, this man makes me hate it all anew. He makes Douglass a paid speaker immediately after. Says, you got skills. We need you. Travel, be our voice to the public. And he sets Douglass off on that journey that takes him through the 1840s to his narrative. But when Douglass goes to the British Isles, those trips into Ireland, Scotland, England, Douglass no longer has Garrison watching over his shoulder anymore. And Douglass rapidly begins asserting his own independence over there, recognizing, wait a minute, I think Garrison and others, in Douglass's view, is using me. I think they're using me as a tool. They want me to stand on a stage and tell a bunch of sad stories about how awful my past was. And no denying my past was awful, because I don't just want to be the emotional hook for other people to come in and fundraise off of. I want to be the intellectual leader who is not only going to explain the realities of the system, but challenge the system at its highest levels. Garrison's not a big fan of that approach. He tells Douglass over and over, just tell your story, tell your story. And he says, let us handle the philosophy. So when Douglass returns in 1847 from the British Isles, when he publishes his new newspaper, Garrison cuts him off at that moment. He says, you're going out on your own here. And they very strongly turn in, not enemies per se, but again, the broad movement of abolition. They quickly begin believing each other is the biggest problem confronting abolition. They fracture, unfortunately, pretty dramatically.
Was that close to the time that Whittier and Garrison began to go their separate ways? Do you know that?
So you'll have to help me out with exactly when Whittier and Garrison began going their separate ways. That
well, I
don't
think
know.
Whittier wanted to stay very involved with the women's movement too. And I think Garrison was just only for slavery and abolition. So they went. Yeah. It might have been after Pennsylvania, the burning of Pennsylvania Hall. I'm not sure exactly, but I do know that there was. I don't want to say an angry split, but certainly a philosophical split.
Absolutely.
And I don't think Whittier was a very well man at that time either. Maybe he never was a well man.
Yeah, some of you would unquestionably know Whittier better than I do. Some of my readings seem to suggest that it was health reasons and other things that caused him to step back, not an internal commitment or lack of conviction in what he was doing. But the time period sounds correct, because when Douglass returns and has that break with Garrison, he's learned through the British Isles that it's this broader sense of human rights that is the issue, not just slavery. And so he too throws in his lot with the Women's Rights Convention. He's there at Seneca Falls in upstate New York, the only man to publicly make an address in support of women's rights. So I think there may be some similar threads. Garrison, a dynamic person, but seems like he was a little bit hard to get along with.
Well,
some folks, even if you agreed with everything.
Yeah, definitely a man with a mission. This is also the very first time, and then I'm going to stop dominating the conversation, the first time that I heard that Frederick Douglass was at Whittier's funeral. I had never heard that before. So
he's there. His second wife, Helen, is accompanying him there.
Yeah.
And again, don't know anything about it. We just know he was there.
Yeah.
Maybe that information is still sitting out there in somebody's attic somewhere. We can always hope.
Yeah. Well, it was an excellent, excellent lecture. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for being here. Other questions? Yes, sir.
In 1997, I was at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. Smithsonian did a 150th anniversary of their founding, an exhibit looking at that entire year. I walked into one of the side rooms and painted above the entryway were the words, "Voices of Dissent." And as I walked into the display in the exhibition, on the back wall were three portraits: Frederick Douglass, John Greenleaf Whittier, William Lloyd Garrison. And it struck me that the scholars at the Smithsonian just took a look at that particular year and determined that these were the three most important people in the country in terms of the abolitionist movement. I was also struck by the fact that even though, and your talk was excellent, that they maybe only met once, and then I was aware of the one meeting, and that also that he did attend the funeral. But the fact that he carried on Whittier's poetry through his life, and in those days people recited from memory. Mm-hmm. And they may have written it down, but a lot of times they recited from memory. I just found it fascinating to connect all three of those people.
Absolutely. Amazing individuals, each of them, and to know they're operating in this same world and may have even known each other far better than we are aware of. The one thing that really makes me ponder is that one confirmed meeting between Douglass and Whittier, the language that he uses, and especially in the world of Whittier and others, we all understand language can be interpreted many different ways by many different people. But Douglass uses the phrase in his description to his audience that if I want to see him again. And so to me, that could mean many different things. It could be interpreted much. I interpret it as like maybe they have some kind of physical interaction, or at least been at a convention together or something. It implies to me there's some kind of meeting, but again, I can't prove that at this point. But I think this is a field that there's more to this story than is yet known to us.
Well, it was pre-pandemic, so I can't tell you what year, but the African American Meeting House, Smith Court in Boston, on the backside of Beacon Hill, had an exhibit on Frederick Douglass with, I think, seemed like there were over 100 photographs there. I don't know if it's still ongoing, but are you aware of that exhibit they had in Boston?
Yeah, so it's my understanding that's been rotated off since that time. But yeah, one of the amazing things about Frederick Douglass is he was the most photographed American of the 19th century. There's more pictures of him than any other person just a few of them, scattered behind me. We had 161 known photographs have been found of him so far. And that's 30 more photographs than even Abraham Lincoln had. who's the number 2 person right behind him. Right? Douglass is using, as he sees it, photography is one of the arts in his understanding. And he's dialing into all of the arts to his maximum capability here. So photography is just an art.
In that exhibit, they also spoke of Douglass's, today it's social media and the awareness of social media. In that period in time, if you look at every photograph, he is impeccably dressed. He's never looking slovenly. I mean, he's well dressed and well presented, as kind of a using the media.
Exactly.
So,
this is intentional because he knows for a majority of at least white Americans, this is going to be likely the only photograph of a Black American that they will see, at least the way. And so he knows what that means also is there's a responsibility because the other images of Black Americans that would be proliferating in the culture at the time would be kind of these woodcut caricatures in newspapers and things of the happy slave, working out in a field without a shirt on something. That's why he doesn't smile. It's not because he was a joyless person. He doesn't want to do anything to feed into those racist stereotypes that are everywhere. So when you see these photos, exactly what he wants is exactly what you said: dignified, prestigious, serious, educated, intellectual, political, artistic, all of these things. That's why he's taken so many photos. And nowadays we can take 160 photos, in 2 minutes without not taking our finger off, the camera real fast. Every one of these is an intentional occasion to make the appointment, to sit down, to have the photographer there. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of power in how he uses images.
I'll just, final question and I'll jump off. How did he become educated? Was he self-educated that by 15 years of age, he was literate?
Yeah, so I skimmed over that real quick in what we were doing. The quick version of it, and when he's 8 years old, he's enslaved for his first 20 years of life. When he's 8 years old, he's moved to a new family of enslavers up in Baltimore City. This family of enslavers is Hugh and Sophia Auld. Hugh and Sophia Auld have never forcibly held a human being in bondage before. So they haven't been steeped in the previous traditions of those who'd run these larger labor camps and other things of this is what we do, this is what we don't do. They didn't understand so much of what was unspoken to other whites who are running the enslavement system. Hugh and Sophia Auld have a young son, Tommy. Frederick is there to take care of this young son, Tommy. It's a part of his responsibility that he's been given. And Sophia is teaching her son to read during these years, having never owned a human being before, never claimed ownership of a human being before. She doesn't understand that if you have one kid that you're teaching to read, maybe you should also teach the second child how to read at the same time. She's treating Frederick like a human being, which I think we would all say is probably a decent thing to do, but that's not what the system has ingrained on her is the right thing to do. So Frederick learns the alphabet from her and basic structure of 2- and 3-letter words before Hugh Auld comes home early one day and sees her teaching him how to read and throws a fit over it. That moment was transformative in Frederick's journey because he doesn't know everything yet. He's got the basic structure, but he reflects back from the age of 8, that moment of Hugh Auld's tirade against literacy. He says, that was the first anti-slavery lecture I ever heard. If he sees a danger in literacy, I must learn reading and writing because that clearly is the tool of destruction of this system. And from that point forward, he has to learn secretly because Hugh and Sophia are really suspicious of him. So he sneaks out and he will take his food. He'll starve himself on his food rations to trade it to the poor white immigrant boys around the Baltimore streets. He'll give them his food in exchange. They'll show him the new sounds of a letter or structure of longer words. And he's copying things with chalk on fence posts that he's painting. He first, writes out an S to practice it and has them come and evaluate it in exchange for food before covering over. So all of this combined, by 13, he's fully literate, able to read and write. The foundations of that from Sophia, unintentionally helping to destroy the very system she was trying to uphold. So right place, right time. And he made the most of it to continue pushing that knowledge where there's a reason Hugh had that fit about me learning. What's so threatening about a Black man who can read and write?
Interesting.
I just want to say, I got goosebumps there at the end when you showed that tile that has the birthplace on it, to think that the poetry of Whittier was so powerful that it affected Douglass to that degree that he would, quote him repeatedly in his book and in his speeches, and then have that as like a treasured possession that he kept in his home. That was very powerful. So,
and I want to be very clear talking about that tile. All of us have all sorts of different things in different places. This tile of John Greenleaf Whittier, it's not sitting in the back of some closet somewhere randomly. This is front and center when you enter the house, in the middle of his fireplace mantle, in his parlor. Mm-hmm. It is a very prominent position. It's not just some random corner of a cool little antique over here. And we've got it there today, obviously, but we also have photographs of the home at the time. We know it was there in the 1890s, mm-hmm. in that same location. And his home is just a menagerie of wonderful, amazing antiquities from around the world, but kind of that center thing, which again, to me, reveals there's more to this story than has yet been uncovered. Mm-hmm. Is why is Whittier's birthplace right there front and center for every journalist, politician, family member, admirer who comes in? I mean, in fairness, the tile's not large. It's probably about maybe 8 by 8, I would say, roughly. But again, it's anchoring everything in the room. Mm-hmm. There's meaning here.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what began this journey for me, is this thing, just going through some of the collection and his various items in the house and saying, well, who is this guy and why does he have this thing and what's the connection here, and trying to piece together little bits and pieces of what we're able to find. Like, clearly he thought it was important. I think we're starting to unravel some of that.
At the Whittier home in Amesbury, which is where John Greenleaf Whittier spent his adult life before he moved to Danvers for the final years, he kept a guest book. He had a room there, and he kept a guest book, and everybody that came, of course, signed it. That left the Whittier home and went to Harvard. And supposedly it's in the Harvard archives. I have never gone down yet to go through to see who came to Amesbury to see John Greenleaf Whittier. And maybe Frederick Douglass did on some occasion.
That would be fascinating to know if his name does or doesn't appear in that address book. Yeah. It's a great thing. Remember for this, wherever we travel, address books are super important for historians. No matter where you are, sign your name. Not for funding reasons, for those sites or things. Sign your name, so you never know, and we'll try to figure out, were you there? Priceless.
Yeah. So how did you get interested in doing this?
So Kaylee had reached out to me one occasion and was wanting to learn more about a presentation related to...
Who's Kaylee?
I'm Kaylee. I'm the director of the Whittier Birthplace.
Really? Hi, Kaylee.
Hi, nice to meet you, Janet.
Nice to meet you. We should get together.
Absolutely.
Okay, excuse me.
No, that's just fine. Just like as we were talking about John Greenleaf Whittier, Garrison, and Douglass, they're all about making connections even amongst their own journeys and finding that strength. So she may be even able to speak better to the origins of this because she's just reached out one day, and I'd always been curious to know more, and this gave me an excuse to try to do a little bit of a deeper dive and see what may or may not exist out there.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah, so we run this virtual lecture series in the off season. It's a way for us to keep people thinking about Whittier even when the historic house is not open. And I've kind of got a running list of historic people that I know Whittier interacted with, Douglass being one of them. And as I make contacts with either other museums that focus on those other historic people, or I hear of authors who have written stories related to Whittier, or Quaker history. It's pretty broad. We've had quite a few speakers. We had speakers from the Amesbury Friends Meeting House. We had somebody from the Dover, New Hampshire Friends Meeting House. We've had a speaker from the Wenham Museum who talked about The Witch of Wenham, one of Whittier's poems. We've had fiction writers and professors from universities. So it's broad, and it's I always learn something, and it's a chance for us to kind of broaden our knowledge base by reaching out to other interesting people who have stories to tell.
Good. Well, I'll be in touch with you, Kaylee.
Yes, I will just let everybody know that tonight's recording will be available on YouTube. I should have it posted by tomorrow. So I'll, look for that link. It'll be on our website and on our YouTube page, obviously, and our Facebook page. So share the link if you had a good time tonight with your friends who weren't able to join us. Yeah. This is the end of our season because we are opening for the public in May. But join us again next winter. And yeah, have a good night, everybody. Any final questions for me or for Kevin?
Just a wonderful lecture. I applaud you. It was. Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being here.
Great job. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.